So we are still talking about the biosphere. That has not changed. The biosphere, remember, is anywhere that life exists, and there are three basic sections of the biosphere: atmosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere. We saw those back in chapter 1. But because we're talking about the biosphere, we're really focused on the life that exists there. And if we were to take the biosphere and sort of split it up into smaller categories, that is where we get ecosystems. Now, ecosystem is probably a word that you've heard a bunch of times before. You're probably familiar with things like the tropical rainforest and the tundra. Those are examples of ecosystems. We're not going to focus on the categories necessarily. That might have been what you have done in the past. We're going to focus on the things that make up each of these ecosystems. So we're going to focus on the characteristics of an ecosystem, not necessarily like what's its latitude and how many centimeters of precipitation does it get, but we're going to focus on the basic characteristics. And we're going to split the characteristics up into two categories: biotic or abiotic. And since we already used these words in the carbon cycle, hopefully you remember, biotic refers to things that are living, and abiotic refers to things that are non-living. So if I were to ask you, what are the biotic characteristics of a particular part of the biosphere, a particular ecosystem, a biotic characteristic is any other organism that exists. And by any, I mean any. Anything that is alive can count as a biotic characteristic of some organism's ecosystem. On the abiotic side, I put a couple of examples to start us off. Things like water. Now, when I say water, that's very vague. I could be talking about water quality. I could be talking about water availability. I could be talking about water temperature. So there's a bunch of things about water that I could be discussing that could affect an organism that lives in a particular ecosystem. I could be talking about minerals, and in the minerals category, I could say minerals or nutrients. So what types of things are available in the soil, let's say. So if we look back to chapter 2, we know that, for example, nitrogen is important. We know how nitrogen cycles. We know that phosphorus is important. Carbon is important. Those are just a few of the main ones, but there are hundreds of minerals that organisms use for their survival. And we could add a bunch of other things in this abiotic category, depending on what the organism is and what their ecosystem is. So I left this third one sort of empty because there are many, many, many things that could affect an organism's survival and affect their life that are not living. So to help us get a bigger list, especially in the abiotic category, I'm asking us to do a couple of questions that come out of your textbook. So you don't actually need to get your textbook out because I wrote the question here. But what we're going to do is we're going to take three organisms: pronghorns, humans, and starfish. And we're going to see if we can consider for each of these organisms what would be some abiotic factors and what would be some biotic factors that would affect their survival. So I think I'll start asking people for some of their suggestions, because that might trigger you to think of something else that you could put onto your list. When we're talking about abiotic and biotic components, we're trying to think of things that could affect this organism's survival. So either things that it needs so that it can survive, or things that if we added them, maybe would reduce its ability to survive. So I'll start in the abiotic category. Does anyone want to give one of their abiotic factors? It could be for the pronghorns or the humans or the starfish, but just one of your abiotic factors. Yes. So for humans, I'm going to put temperature, right, because that's what global warming would be referring to. Now, temperature absolutely would be a thing that affects our survival. We're pretty delicate. We can't survive in really hot or really, really cold temperatures without a whole bunch of protection from that. So temperature would definitely be one of them. And you could quite frankly put temperature on any of the three organisms lists because all organisms would depend on temperature to a certain extent. Even things like the starfish that live in the ocean, it's true that they're not necessarily a warm-blooded organism, but if the ocean were to, say, freeze or completely evaporate, that would be a big deal for those organisms. So for this temperature thing, I'm going to put air or water temperature because they can have different side effects, but temperature is definitely something that would affect survival. Anyone else have anything they want to share that they put in the abiotic category? Yes. Rocks. So I saw Luis put rocks several times on his list, and one of the things I said was you could probably put rocks as an abiotic factor for basically any organism as long as you explained how. So I think you told me that in your humans category you were going to say that rocks could be important for shelter. And so if we're talking about land, rocks would be part of the land part of the biosphere. The amount of land could be important for shelter for humans or for any other organism that lives on land. So we could put this idea up here for the pronghorn too. Now, do we live inside of rocks? Not in our particular society, but a lot of things that we live in or exist in are built out of things that come from the rocks, so we can make that extrapolation there. And if we look at our history, of course, we used rocks as shelter. Does anyone else want to share something they have in the abiotic category? Absolutely water. So where did you put it on here? For the first one. So here, water is necessary for life. We saw in the last chapter all of the million things that water does. It allows things to be transported. It helps maintain temperature. It has a weird density. It dissolves things. So water here could have a bunch of things related to it. So if you're going to say water as an abiotic component, I just want you to explain in what capacity. So maybe we're talking here that water is part of the pronghorn's blood. Maybe we're talking here that water is helping to maintain the pronghorn's body temperature. Maybe we're talking here something about osmosis or waste. So the pronghorn needs water so that it can get rid of waste. Probably everyone knows that most organisms need to drink water, which is true, as long as you tell me why they're drinking the water and why it would be important. By giving an effect of water, then you've explained it. Does anyone else want to share another abiotic thing that we could add to the list? So I'll suggest a few more abiotic things. I'm going to pick pronghorns because they breathe. And I'm going to say air quality. So by air quality, I'm talking about the composition of the atmosphere. So we could be specifically referring to pollution. Air quality will affect the pronghorn because it needs to breathe, just like a human does. So this could be a human's abiotic characteristic as well. Since the starfish lives in water, there's a couple of probably fairly water-specific things that we could put. I'm going to start by talking about the sun. Now, does a starfish use the sun for energy? Probably most of you would say no, a starfish is not a producer. I would say yes, it does, because remember, the sun is the original source of energy in a food chain for the large majority of food chains that exist. So unless the starfish is at the very bottom of the ocean where there is no sunlight, it is probably part of a food chain that's based on photosynthesis, which means that the sun will affect the starfish because it will affect the organism that the starfish is eating. Here, we could also put water concentration. We could talk about salt. We could talk about other minerals. We could talk about waste. So organisms that live in the water are particularly susceptible to things that are soluble in water. So if, for example, there is a bunch of mercury dissolved in water, that might have an effect on the starfish's life because of biomagnification. If there was, let's say, an oil spill in the ocean, that would be something abiotic that could affect the starfish's life because now it would be covered with oil. Yes, absolutely, you could talk about that. So now, when he says seismic properties, we're talking about like the movement of the Earth's crust. Underneath the ocean, the plates that make up the land part of our planet are constantly moving. If we get to near the surface, that's where earthquakes can happen. But underneath the Earth, the plates are always moving, and that causes shifts in, say, water currents that could change water temperature. It could affect what is or isn't living in a particular area of the ocean. So that would be another excellent thing that you could put. So those are just some examples of things that you could say that are abiotic. Now let's go into the biotic side of things. Does anyone want to share for any of the three organisms what they said as their biotic examples? Yes, go for it. Predators. So I'll just start at the top. If you put something that eats a pronghorn or something that eats a human or something that eats a starfish, you put a predator. On the flip side of that, I think we should also write the word prey. What does this organism eat? So the number, the quality, the availability of predator and prey will absolutely affect an organism because they're part of the same food chain. Does anyone else want to share another suggestion for a biotic thing? How about other pronghorns? And the word I would use here is competition. Other organisms of the same species could be a biotic factor affecting your survival because now you're in competition for limited resources with them. I saw at least one person wrote mosquitoes on their list, so I'm going to put that next. Mosquitoes are things that affect us, and what is a mosquito classified as? Does anyone know what type of organism we would call it? So a mosquito would go in maybe the parasite category, things that require another organism to survive. You might remember learning in, I think it's grade 7 and then again in grade 9, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. It's interactions that organisms have with each other. So mosquitoes are an example of a parasite, but we could also put organisms that would be examples of commensalism and mutualism. So depending on the organism, there might be something that helps it survive where that organism is not particularly affected. So for example, if we are a person who is living in a forested area and we are using the tree for shelter, we would be gaining shelter from the tree, and the tree probably would be very unaffected by our presence there if we were just using it for shelter. For an example of mutualism, that would be where two organisms benefit each other's survival. So I'm sure you've heard of some of these examples before. The bird that picks the food out of the crocodile's teeth, the little organisms that live on the skin of, say, a shark that clean the shark off, but then in turn they get protection. Those are examples of mutualism with animals. If we're talking about people, we might say, I'm going to put a dog. And you might say, how would the dog be an example of mutualism? Well, if I have a dog that lives with me, I provide it with food and with shelter, and it provides me with companionship, so it's mutually beneficial. So anything that is an example of mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, competition, predator-prey, all of those interaction words would all be excellent things that you could use. The other words that you might add would be the words consumers, producers, decomposers, any of the words that we use to describe trophic levels, so anything that's part of the starfishes or the humans or the pronghorns food chain would be something that affects its survival. It could be directly or it could be indirectly. And then the last thing I want to put, Will, you have this on your list. Is there maybe a biotic thing that I haven't mentioned yet? I think you had it on your first one. Mm. Humans. We are probably the biotic factor that has the biggest effect on a lot of organisms' survival. And it's not because we're part of their natural food chain or we live in their habitat. It's because we do things like hunt them and develop on land that they are supposed to be living on. We pollute the air, which hurts organisms that live thousands of kilometers away from where we're doing the polluting. So humans, we are living, so we are definitely a biotic factor, but we cause changes in a lot of the abiotic factors of an organism's environment. So, would the question that I asked you on a test be, what's a biotic factor? No, it would be, here's an example of an organism, discuss things that are biotic that could affect its survival and give an explanation. So as long as you can explain how something would affect an organism's survival, you would be able to answer the question. Like you can see, there are lots of correct answers, just depends on the scenario that you're given. Usually what I do with a question like this is I would give you a context to read, and then you determine from the context which things are the biotic and which things are the abiotic factors. So we are going to do a little bit of vocabulary for the next little bit. When you are an ecologist and you are studying ecology, you need to be able to use 4 terms fairly specifically: species, population, community, and ecosystem. So we are trying to determine why or how the number of organisms changes by determining which factors affect its survival, but also by discussing 4 different levels of study. So the first level of study is studying a species. The definition of a species is members of a population that can reproduce together to produce fertile offspring. I taught grade 9. I remember teaching that exact definition to my grade 9 class. I'm not going to ask you what's a species on a test, but I do want you to know that's what the condition that you have to meet to be called a species. So that's the definition. But we're always talking about what is the ecologist going to study. And since this whole section is about what can affect the organism's survival, if we're going to look at a species, just an individual species, the things that we will look at would be, first of all, adaptations. Now we'll see the word adaptation again when we start talking about evolution and maybe how things have changed over time. But the word adaptation would be the key thing that you would focus on if we were studying just one species, not the other organisms that affect it, but just the one species. So for example, here, there's a picture of a flower, and the flower lives on the top of a mountain. So it just tells you the name of the flower is Old Man of the Mountain, which is not particularly important to your survival. And on the right, these are the Banff spring snails, the ones that live really close to the heat source. Over here, we could note some adaptations that this flower probably has that allow it to live at the top of a mountain. For example, for a plant to live at the top of a mountain where there is usually less water available, they have to be able to resist water loss, or to survive with low amounts of water, or to conserve water. The other thing is that it would probably have to be able to resist cold, and that's because the higher you go up in altitude, the colder it is. So the Old Man of the Mountain is a flower that has adapted to survive in drier, colder conditions, which is why it's a flower that can grow on the top of a mountain. Now on the other side, we have sort of the opposite condition, these snails. These snails thrive in heat, and they thrive in areas that have sulfur in them. So they have adapted to, instead of perhaps be harmed by heat and be harmed by sulfur, to use it to their advantage, for their survival. And so generally, when we look at a species and we look at its adaptations, this will tell us about the organism's distribution. In other words, where it lives. And since we're just talking about where the organism lives, because we're only looking at one species, we are generally studying just the abiotic conditions at this particular level of study. So that's one thing that we would study. Abiotic conditions about the environment where the organism lives and what it has that allows it to live there. Now the next vocabulary word is the word population. And the word population refers to a species, but specifically members, plural, of the same species in an area at a specific time. In other words, they live together. If we are going to study populations, which is something that biologists do a lot when they're trying to figure out what affects survival, instead of looking at abiotic conditions and just one organism and how it is adapted, we would look at things like the size of the population. So sometimes just knowing whether or not an organism can live somewhere isn't as telling as knowing how many of them live somewhere. So if we look at size of the population, we would also be focused on it changing. Specifically, rate. So how fast? If I can see that the size of a population is changing quickly, that must mean that some factor in the environment, biotic or abiotic, is either really helping it survive or really decreasing its survival. So here I have some lilies. If any of you have ever had lilies in your yard, you might know this. Lilies are actually considered a weed because they're very invasive, they're hard to kill, and they multiply quite easily. So lilies are an example of a population that is increasing. So I know I like lilies, I think they're pretty, and I plant them in my yard, and my dog just is obsessed with digging them up, but they come back every year, all the time, because it's really hard to kill a lily. So they're an example of something where the population is increasing. This example here, it's a collared pica. It's just a cute little sort of rodent type organism. It's described a little bit in your textbook, and there's a picture showing it as well. But what happened, or what went on with these organisms, is that their population declined quite a bit over like a 10-year span, a 9-year span in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And one of the things that we think might have affected their population is actually global warming, the thing that you mentioned earlier today. The other thing that's important to consider is the nature of the population. So, which members are in it? And I put a picture here to try to represent diversity a little bit. Sometimes the population might be really large, but there's not a lot of diversity in the population. And having more diversity is generally preferable. You might remember learning that biodiversity is important because if an environmental factor changed, at least some of the organisms should be adapted to survive it. So in this category, there would be biotic and abiotic factors affecting this. So for example, for the lilies, when their population increases, sometimes it means, for example, that other plants have decreased. So I know in my yard, if there's a space in the dirt where nothing else is growing, that's where a lily pops up. So the absence of other plants growing in their path could be a thing that is affecting their population. So that would be a biotic factor. For the pica, it would be temperature is what we hypothesize is causing some of the decline. So that's an abiotic factor. And the diversity of a population would be due to a number of things. I would say the diversity of the human population is due more to biotic factors than abiotic factors because it's about reproduction and choice and things like that. The third level of study is where we look at communities. So a community is one step up. A species is just one organism. A population is a bunch of them. A community is where you have populations, plural, of different organisms in the same area. So when we consider a community, we can ask ourselves questions like, how many populations are there? So are there a bunch of different species that live there, or is there only maybe one or two different types of species? And then how do they interact with each other? So for the how many populations are there, I put an example here comparing a forest to a fragment. Where in a forest, you probably have a bunch of different populations mingling together. But in a fragment, where it's just a group of trees standing alone, you generally have a lower number of populations. For the interactions, we already mentioned competition. And there's two types of competition that exist. It could be intraspecific or interspecific. That means within a species or between species. So on the top, I'm showing two males butting heads. They're probably fighting over a female. And on the bottom, of course, that's a lion and a hyena, and they are in competition for a food source. So competition doesn't have to be with just your own species. It could be with any other organism that wants your food source. We have predator-prey, like we mentioned already on the first page. Who's eating you? Who are you eating? And then lastly, abiotic factors, like here, sun and water availability, will affect the community that's trying to live there. And then the last level that we would talk about is the level of ecosystem, which would be the biggest level. In an ecosystem, that's the interaction of everything else that we just said. So how are all of these things, biotic and abiotic factors, interacting? So I gave a pretty specific example here to show how biotic and abiotic factors would interact. And the example is a forest fire. After you have a forest fire, you're basically starting over from scratch. And so first, organisms that live well in open spaces establish themselves. Then they create shade, they alter the soil, and they make the environment more suitable for other organisms. So biotic things affect the abiotic factors, which in turn affect which biotic things live there, which will affect the abiotic factors again. So the key thing is this. The environment changes over time. It has to. And organisms survive depending on this big, complex group of conditions. So one species or population or community or biotic factor changes, then that changes the environment for everything else that lives there as well. Now here I just put a little flow thing to remind you that species is kind of the top level where it's the most specific. Population is a bunch of members of a species. Community is a bunch of populations. An ecosystem is where you take all of that plus all of the abiotic factors and put them all together.